Hi, welcome back. This episode is about graphic design and some of the principles behind graphic design. It's worth saying, I think, graphic design is not a science or an engineering topic on the whole, and much of graphic design and art and design is from experience and from creative exploration of what does and doesn't work. But we will touch on at the beginning of this episode some of the psychological thinking behind some aspects of visual perception that influence graphic design right across the board, and came from a group of people, the Gestalt psychologists. Now, to some extent, what they did is no longer with us, and to some extent it is, and parts of what is in fact used is that those parts of their thinking on human vision. And they're interested in understanding how we obtained meaning, how we understood how our cognition system worked in perceiving what's a chaotic world of stimuli coming towards us. So what they're very famous for is looking at this idea of how do you see patterns in things, how do you see shapes and holes from just partial stimuli, and some of these images here are those. So on the left, you'll see some discs with a pie removed and some corners, just V-shaped corners, arranged together in such a way that you'll find it really hard not to see a white triangle over a set of dark discs over another white triangle with a border around it. And it comes from the brain's ability, in part, what we were saying before, to see the world in 3D and to interpret it in 3D. So it thinks, well, what are the likely physical situations which bring about this visual stimulus on the retina? And a triangle over a set of discs over another triangle is, in this case, the brain's most likely hypothesis. And those of you who are statisticians will love to know that maximum likelihood theory comes in here, and you can easily model this as a Bayesian process based on a set of priors about the world. But we won't do that. We'll just talk about the psychology. I'll just go through A, B, C, and D. So A triangle again on top of a set of discs. B, I often find this one harder myself, but is a rope or a snake wrapped around a vertical pole. C, the kind of sphere with a set of spikes in it, is very much a 3D object when you see it. And D again, probably you'll see it if you know of these things, a Loch Ness monster swimming through a lake. So in this, one of the famous things is that the sum is different to the parts is a misquote often applied to this set of psychologists. What they actually said is the whole is other than the sum of the parts. So if they're looking at these images, they would say, well, there's a set of parts here, and they make up a certain, you can count them and you can make them up into a certain set of things, 3 corners and 3 discs in the left-hand image case. But the whole is something different. You don't see that. What you see is a triangle over some discs over a triangle. So you're seeing an other thing. And they wanted to understand how this came apart. And as visualization producers, we also want to understand this, so we know that we don't, again, inadvertently produce sensations we don't want to, and that we know that when we draw things, that most of the time they're conveying the thing that we set out to draw. One way in which Gestalt psychology really helps is if you look at pattern and structure. So here, how do you group shapes? How do you group sets of shapes in an image? And if you look at these 8 different principles that the Gestalt psychologists produced, they said, well, one way is proximity. If you have things closer together, as on the top left, you find it very hard not to see that as 3 rows of 4. If you try and see it as 4 rows of 3 vertically, because of the differential spacing, you don't group them so naturally. Similarity is a strong cue. Enclosure is a very strong cue. Symmetry is also a cue. Closure, you'll tend to take broken things and put them together if there's a pattern that you recognize in them. Same with continuity, very similar thing. You'll join up the dots in dotted lines quite easily without thinking about it. Connection is a very strong cue, and once you've used most of the others, connection will come on top of that. So this set of principles about how we see the world and how we group things was put together by these psychologists and understand in great depth. So let's look at the individual principles and try and see how they apply in different images. So here's proximity, and you can see if you separate things out, they become clearer and more identifiable as groups. And you can overlay on top of that, in this case, for example, color as well, and get subgroups within groups. And if you choose to have people track color across different groups, that works as well. In terms of similarity, you can pick out here maybe quite easily the 4 grey verticals, the 2 grey horizontals, and the block of grey versus the block of brown. And similarly, the similar colors stand out. So you've got ways of grouping things by similar feature. Connection is a very strong cue to grouping. And you can see here the vertical and horizontal grouping, and it will override in case B color. So you've got red and black dots, and by using a line between them, you can group a red and a black dot, where you might naturally group them by color. So connection, very strong cue here. And the same for shape and size. Enclosure is a great tool for grouping as well. And you can see we can group by similarity at the top, by connection, which connects dissimilar items in this case, and then by enclosure, which groups separately 2 items from the whole 4 items there. So this idea of layered principles and which principles override which is quite important to understand. Here's an example in a graphing situation. So on the left, there's 2 sets of data here, and you can just about pick them out. There's dots and squares, and there's a line of dots and squares going through this graph. On the right-hand side, when you bring out the connections, that really clearly shows you the lines. And then when you add on top of that an enclosure, you can highlight grouped parts of, in this case, a similar peak in the data sets together. Another example of applying the principles is this kind of k-means clustering approach. If you just rely on proximity, you kind of get the idea there's 2 clusters in here. And if you color them differently, you can clearly see the 2 clusters separated out there. And then if you do a calculation of an enclosure, so this is the kind of k-means approach, and you put an enclosure around the different groups, you can highlight 3 separate groups in this data set. So that's proximity, similarity, and enclosure, giving us more clarity on the data and the messages in the data. And remember, you need that message to be correct. If these 3 groups are there and you're saying these are the 3 groups in this data, you can visually convey that message, even if it's not in the data. So you want to make sure that the calculation of whatever approach, k-means or otherwise, you use is also reflected in the visual. No visual lies here. Figure ground perception is an interesting cue. I'm not going to dwell on it because it's not often used in visualization, but this, are you seeing the front or the back, is a nice visual illusion. Do you see the faces or the vase? Do you see fish or birds? All those kinds of interesting visual phenomena. This is a very famous one. You might or might not see in it. I'll give you a few seconds. You might pause the video at this point. And if you look in the middle towards the right on the screen, you should see a kind of a dog, a Dalmatian dog, a white dog with black spots on it. And maybe in the background a tree or a lawn. That's figure ground perception, where you're extracting a pattern from a very noisy data set. And that is something in visualization we're very interested in. How do you encourage people to extract patterns? Normally, you would hope that the pattern extraction would work because we've highlighted the patterns in some way using color or shape or enclosure. But in many noisy data sets, it's not always possible to do that mathematically, and you might give people the chance to do it just visually. So there's a great graphic designer called Robin Williams who's written a number of introductory books on graphic design, and one of them is the Non-Designer's Design Book. And if you want just a set of principles you can easily apply to any visual presentation, these are they. I strongly encourage you to get and read a book because it's a really nice summary. And we'll see what they are in a second. And they relate to a summary of principles from Gestalt theory in reality. Just to show you a design, and a design that would not be easy to derive from scientific principles, but works every day. This is the physical layout of the underground map. And very famously, Harry Beck redesigned it to look like this so that you could more clearly see the stations and the connections on the map. Go back again, this is the geographic version. It's not so clear where all the lines are going, I guess. Now, the only problem with this, of course, is that if you ever learnt your mapping of London from the underground map, as I did when I was younger, it is very difficult to navigate yourself around on the surface on streets because you have a map in your mind that looks like this, whereas the real map in the real world looks like this. And things like walking from Leicester Square to Piccadilly Circus, looks like they go around a corner on the map, and in real life it's just a straight line. Design for non-designers. So the aesthetics here come in. Everybody can make really ugly diagrams and really hard to read pictures. And just applying 4 simple design principles can help improve them. Alignment, proximity, repetition, and contrast. Even if it's a CV, even if it's a business card, you're not going to turn into a professional designer, but it'll help improve layout in everything you do. Proximity, relationships between things on a page, and you want to group related items together, clustering things. And so here's an example, a very trivial and simple example on a business card. The address has been spread around the card and the name is in the middle. If you move the name to the top and the address to one grouping at the bottom, it's much clearer who it is and where they live and what their phone number is. It's otherwise you're doing a visual search on the page to try and glue together in your mind what the name of the person is. Is it Bag End or Frodo Baggins? What their address is. Is it 551212 or 2968? Proximity is great for a number of things, and one of them is showing hierarchy. So on the left, you could have a set of links on a web page with no hierarchy and no change in grouping by spatial distance. And there's no implication there that these things are subsections. So on the right, if you group things together and you change their presentation slightly, you instantly see the overall 2 categories and the subgroups within those categories. Things to try: move headlines closer to the text they're about than are not. Make sure captions are put close to photographs, not close to text in a document. Move things apart. Critical thing. If you're drawing something with 2 graphs and 2 headlines, make the space between the graphs and the headlines for those graphs bigger than the space between the graph and its own headline. Then you'll automatically use proximity to group the right headline to the right graph. Alignment. Okay, well, line things up, don't do this. And try not to have very long pages, don't have things on the far side, just make sure things are aligned. And here's some examples. This used to be the case on web pages all the time. There are now automated tools which make it harder to do this wrong, but don't line things up randomly. A vertical line for flush left and a vertical line down a page, right down a page like that, will help people track as their eye movements go down and try and read these things. What is the next label? What is the next thing I should read on the page? Whereas on the left, you're having to scan backwards and forwards as well as up and down to find things. Robin Williams suggests doing centered alignment is not a good thing. And on the left is an example, and on the right is an example of left flush. Centered alignment means, again, you have to scan sideways as well as vertically to find the next start point for a sentence. So left flushing text in the English language means that you can start each sentence on the left as you're supposed to read it. Relating back to, we talked about non-data ink when we were talking about Tufts' work on visually displaying quantitative information. If a table has borders, you can very often get rid of the borders just by doing alignment. So if you align things and you separate things, remember proximity to, you will get columns aligned on the left flush of the text. And if they're slightly close together vertically, that'll also help bring them together. The outcome of this is that you minimize non-data ink again. The table boundaries are not data ink, they're just separators, and you save the ink for the things that are in the table, the words themselves. Repetition is a good way to link things on different pages, different sites. This was a set of actual web pages running at the same time when I started working at Durham's computer science department a number of years ago. They didn't look like they were in the same department. Repetition, Apple does and did very well. You get similar fonts, you get similar design in the icons and similar design in the tabs, similar layout and similar use of the page. So a lot of unified style items bring things together. Here's a simple example of repetition. This is a community college, I think, and you don't even have to use the same color as long as you use the same layout and shapes and a similar logo and text layout on the page. Simple, but very clearly the same organization did these. So finally, contrast. We talked about contrast a number of times before. It draws your eye to things. It will indicate hierarchy. If you're going to use contrast, make it very different. So make it a different boldness, a different font, a different color, something that makes things stand out a lot. One of the things that can sometimes help is if you put the first and the last line of a page in a similar visual format. So here we've bolded the final line of the page, and one of the things that encourages people to do is go back to the start to pattern match to the last time they saw the same pattern. And designers often use this to try and wrap you around to reading something more than once. Contrast and repetition. Well, you decide if you like the left or right more. The underlining at the beginning and end of this table kind of gives you a really clear idea that the table is there and it's a single table and you finish reading it. On the left, it's a bit less clear why the underlining is there. So, finally, graphic design key points. Try and learn a few principles. Don't go off and learn a whole library of designs. Try and copy good design ideas when you come across them. I would certainly add to this, look for scientifically validated ideas in design. Look for things that psychologists have researched, like Gestalt theories that they've thought about and tested with people, and use those. At the level of design, you don't need to take it super seriously, but try and combine just 4 basic principles and you'll be able to create exciting, better looking documents of all kinds. Look for where you can do proximity, alignment, repetition, and contrast. And please do remember spelling and grammar checkers exist, because a spelling mistake on a beautifully designed page is not a nice thing to see. Okay, thank you. That's the end for this episode.